Chapter 9. Phil and Patches were riding that day in the country about Old Camp. Early in the afternoon they heard the persistent bawling of a calf, and upon riding towards the sound found the animal deep in the cedar timber, which in that section thickly covers the ridges. The calf was freshly branded with the tally-holt iron. It was done, Phil said, the day before, probably in the late afternoon, and the youngster was calling for his mother. "It's strange that she's not somewhere around," said Patches. "It'd be more strange if she was," retorted the cowboy shortly, and he looked from the calf to the distant Tally-Holt mountain as though he was considering some problem which he did not for some reason care to share with his companion. "There's no use looking around for her," he added with grim disappointment. "That's always the way. If we had ridden this range yesterday, instead of away over there in the Mint Wash country, I'm always about a day behind." There was something in the manner and in the quiet speech of the usual sunny-tempered foreman that made his companion hesitate to ask questions, or to offer comment with the freedom that he had learned to feel the first day of their riding together. During the hours that followed, Phil said very little, and when he did speak, his words were brief and often curt, while, to Patches, he seemed to study the country over which they rode with unusual care. When they had eaten their rather gloomy lunch, he was in the saddle again almost before Patches had finished, with seemingly no inclination for their usual talk. The afternoon was nearly gone, and they were making their way homeward, when they saw a cross-triangle bull that had evidently been hurt in a fight. The animal was one of the Dean's much-prized Herefords, and the wound needed attention. "We've got to dope that up," said Phil, "or the screw-worms will be working on her for sure." He was taking down his riata and watching the bull, which was rumbling a sullen and deep-voiced challenge as he spoke. "Can I be of help?" said Patches anxiously as he viewed the powerful beast, for this was the first full-grown animal that needed attention that he had seen in his first few days of experience. "No," returned Phil. "Just keeping it clear, that's all. This chap is no calf, and he's sore over his scrap. He'll be on the prod right now." It all happened in a few seconds. The cowboy's horse, understanding from long experience that this threatening mark of his master's riata was in no gentle frame of mind, fretted uneasily, as though dreading his part in the task before them. Patches saw the whirling rope leave Phil's hand and saw it tighten, and as the cowboy threw the weight of his horse against it, and then he caught a confused vision. A fallen, struggling horse with a man pinned to the ground beneath him, and a wickedly lowered head with sharp horns and angry eyes charging right at them. Patches did not think. There was no time to think. With a yell of horror he struck deep with both spurs, and his startled, pain-maddened horse leapt forward. Again he spurred cruelty with all of his strength, and the next bound of his frenzied mount carried him upon those deadly horns. Patches remembered hearing a sickening rip and a scream of fear and pain as he felt the horse under him rise in the air. He never knew how he managed to free himself as he fell backwards with his struggling mount, but he distinctly saw Phil regain his saddle, while his horse was in the very act of struggling to its feet, and he was watching with anxious interest as the cowboy forced his excited mount in front of the bull to attract the beast's wicked attention. The bull, accepting the tantalizing challenge, charged again, and Patches, with a thrill of admiration for the man's coolness and skill, saw that Phil was coiling his rope, even while his frightened horse with terrific leaps avoided those menacing horns. The bull stopped and shook his head in anger over his failure, and looked back towards the man on foot. But again that horse and rider danced temptingly before him, so close that it seemed he could not fail, and again he charged, only to find his mad rush carried him still further from the helpless Patches. And by now Phil had recovered his rope, and the loop was whirling in easy circles above his head. The cow horse, as though feeling the security that was in that familiar motion of his master's arm, steadied himself, and in the few active moments that followed, obedient to every signal of his rider, did his part with almost human intelligence. When the bull was safely tied, Phil went to the frighteningly injured horse, and, with a merciful bullet, ended the animal's suffering. Then he looked thoughtfully at Patches, who stood gazing ruefully at the dead animal, as though he felt himself to blame for the loss of his employer's property. A slight smile lightened the cowboy's face as he noticed his companion's troubling thought. "Well, I suppose I've done her now," said Patches, as though expecting well-merited chastisement. Phil's smile broadened. "You sure have," he returned, as he wiped the sweat from his face. "I'm much obliged to you." Patches looked at him in confused embarrassment. "Don't you know that you just saved my life?" asked Phil dryly. But I killed a good horse of the Dean's," stammered Patches. To which the Dean's foreman returned with a grin. "I reckon Uncle Will can stand the loss, considering." This relieved the tension, and they laughed together. "But tell me something, Patches," said Phil curiously. "Why didn't you shoot the bull when he charged me?" "I honestly didn't think of it," admitted Patches. I really didn't think of anything." The cowboy nodded with understanding approval. "I've noticed that the man to tie to in sudden trouble is the man who doesn't have to think. The man, I mean, who just does the right thing instinctively and waits to think about it afterwards when there's time." Patches was pleased. "I did the right thing, then?" "It was the only thing you could have done to save my life," returned Phil seriously. "If you had tried to use your gun, even if you had managed to hit him, you wouldn't have stopped him in time. If you had been where you could have put a bullet between his eyes, it might have worked, but," he smiled again, "I'm mighty glad you didn't think about trying any experiments. Tell me something else," he added. "Did you realize the chance you were taking for yourself?" Patches shook his head. "I couldn't say that I realized anything except that you were in a bad fix and it was up to me to do something quick." "How'd it happen, anyway?" He seemed anxious to turn the conversation. "Diamond stepped in a hole there," explained Phil. "When he turned over, I sure thought it was all day for me. Believe me, I won't forget this, Patches." For another moment, there was an embarrassed silence, and then Patches said, "What puzzles me is why you didn't take a shot at him after you were up instead of risking your neck again trying to rope him." "Well, there's no use in killing a good bull as long as there's any other way. It's our business to keep him alive. That's what I started in to do, wasn't it?" And thus the cowboy, in a simple word or two, stated the creed of his profession. A creed that permits no consideration of personal danger or discomfort when the welfare of the employer's property is at stake. When they had removed saddle and bridle from the dead horse and had cleaned the ugly wound on the bull's side, Phil said, "Now, Mr. Honorable Patches, you'd better move on down the wash a piece and get out of sight behind one of them cedars. This fella is going to get busy again when I let him up. I'll come along when I've got rid of him." A little while later, as Phil rode out of the cedars toward Patches, a deep bellowing challenge came from up the wash. "He's just telling us what he'll do to us the next chance he gets," chuckled Phil. "Hop up behind me now and we'll get on home." The gloom that all day had seemed to overshadow Phil had effectually banished by the excitement of the incident, and again he was his sunny, cheerful self. As they rode, they chatted and laughed merrily, and then suddenly, as it had happened that morning, the cowboy again turned grim and silent. Patches was wondering what had so quickly changed his companion's mood when he caught sight of two horsemen, riding along the top of the ridge that forms the western side of the wash, their course paralleling that of the cross-triangle men who were following in the bed of the wash. When Patches directed Phil's attention to the riders, the cowboy said shortly, "I've been watching them for the last 10 minutes. And then, as if regretting the manner of his reply, he added more kindly, "If they keep on the way they're going, we'll likely meet them about a mile down the wash where the ridge breaks." "Do you know them?" asked Patches curiously. "It's Nick Cabot and that poor lost dog of Yakopi Joe," Phil answered. "The Tally Holt Mountain outfit," murmured Patches, watching the riders on the ridge with a quickened interest. "Do you know them, Phil? I believe I've seen those fellows before." "You have?" shouted Phil. "Where? When?" "Well, I don't know how to tell you where," Patches replied, "but it was the day that I rode the drift fence. They were on a ridge across a little valley from me." "That must have been this same horse wash that we're following now," replied Phil. "It widened out a bit below here. What makes you think it was Nick and Joe?" "Why, those fellers up there look like the two I saw, one big one and one rather lightweight. They were the same distance from me, you know, and yeah, I'm sure it's the same horses." "Pretty good, Patches, but you ought to have reported it when you got home." I didn't think it was of any importance." "There are 2 rules you must follow, always," said the cowboy, "if you're going to learn to be a top hand in this business. The first is to see everything there is to see, and to see everything about everything that you see. And the second is to remember it all. I don't mind telling you now that Jim Reed found a calf fresh branded with a Tally Holt iron that same afternoon in that same neighborhood, and that is on our side of the drift fence. He ran on to a cross-triangle cow that had lost her calf. There comes our friends now." The 2 horsemen were riding down the side of the hill at an angle that would bring about the meeting which Phil had foreseen. Patches immediately broke the first of the 2 rules, for, while watching the riders, he did not notice that his companion loosened his gun in the holster. Nick Cabot was a large man, big-bodied and heavy, with sandy hair, and those particularly light blue eyes which do not beget confidence. But as the Tally Holt mountain men halted to greet Phil, Patches gave to Nick little more than a passing glance, so interested was he in the big man's companion. It is doubtful if blood, training, environment, and circumstances, the fates, or whatever it is that gives man to individuality, ever marked a man with less manhood than that was given to poor Yakopi Joe. Standing erect, he would have been, perhaps, a little more medium height, but thin and stooped, with a half-starved look as he slouched listlessly in the saddle. It was almost impossible to think of him as a matured man. The receding chin and coarse, loosely opened mouth, the pale, lifeless eyes set too closely together under a low forehead, with a ragged thatch of dead mouse-colored hair, and a furtive, sneaking, lost dog expression, proclaimed him the outcast that he was. The big man eyed Patches as he greeted the cross-triangle foreman. "Howdy, Phil." "Hello, Nick," returned Phil coolly. "Howdy, Joe." The younger man, who was gazing stupidly at Patches, returned the salutation with an unintelligible mutter and proceeded to roll a cigarette. "You folks at Cross Triangle short of horses?" asked Nick with evident attempt of jocularity, and alluding to the situation of the 2 men who were riding one horse. "We got mixed up with a bull back yonder. Phil explained briefly. They can put a horse out of game pretty quick sometimes, commented the other. I've lost a few that way myself. It's about as far from here to my place as it is to Baldwin, or I'd help you out. You're welcome, you know. Much obliged, returned Phil, but we'll make it home all right. I reckon we better be moving along, though. So long. Adios. Throughout this brief exchange of courtesies, Yucca Joe had not moved, except to puff on a cigarette, nor had he ceased to regard Patches with stupid curiosity. As Phil and Patches moved away, he still sat gazing after the stranger, until he was aroused by a sharp word from Nick as the latter turned his horse towards Tallyholt Mountain. Without changing his slouching position in the saddle, and with a final slinking sideways look towards Patches, the poor fella obediently trailed after his master. Patches could not resist the impulse to return for another look at the wretched shadow of manhood that was so interested in him. Well, what do you think of that pair? Asked Phil, breaking in upon his companion's preoccupations. Patches shrugged his shoulders much as he had done that day of his first experiences with the screwworms, and then he said quietly, Do you mind telling me about them, Phil? Well, there's not much to tell, returned the cowboy. That is, there's not much that anybody knows for certain. Nick, he was born in Yocby County. His father, old George Cambert, was one of the kind that seemed honest enough and industrious too, but somehow always seemed to just miss out. They moved away to some place in Southern California when Nick was about growed. He came back 6 years ago and located over there at the foot of Tallyholt Mountain and started his 4-bar-M iron. And one way or another, he's managed to get together quite a bunch of stock. You see, his expenses don't amount to anything hardly. He and Joe batch in an old shack that somebody built years ago, and they do all the riding themselves. Joe, he's not much of a force, but he's handier than you think, as long as there's someone around to tell him what to do and sort of back him up. Nick, though, can do 2 men's work any day of the year. It's strange that a man like Nick would have anything to do with a creature of that poor specimen, mused Patches. Are they related in any way? Nobody knows, answered Phil. Joe first showed up at Prescott about 4 years ago with a man by the name of Dryden, who claimed that Joe was his son. They camped just outside in some dirty old tents and lived by picking up whatever was laying around loose. Dryden wouldn't work, and naturally no one would have Joe. Finally, Dryden was sent up for robbing a store, and Joe nearly went after him. They let him off, I believe, because it was proved pretty well that he was only Dryden's tool and didn't have nerve enough to do any real harm by himself. He drifted around for several months, living like a stray dog until Nick took him in tow. Nick treats him shamefully, abuses him like a beast, and works him like a slave. The poor devil stays on with him because he doesn't know what else to do, I suppose. Is he always like what we saw today? Asked Patches, who seemed strangely interested in that bit of human drift. Does he ever talk? Oh yeah, he'll talk all right when Nick ain't around, or when there's not too many present. Get off somewhere alone with him after he acquires and gets acquainted a little. He's not half bad company as he looks. I reckon that's the main reason why Nick keeps him. You see, no decent cowpuncher would dare work at Tallyholt Mountain, and a man gets mighty lonesome living so much alone. Joe never talks about where he come from or who he is. Shuts up like a clam if you so much as mention anything that looks like you were trying to find out about him. He's not so much a fool as he looks, either, so far as that goes, but he's always got that sneaking coyote sort of look, and whatever he does it in the same way. So in other words, commented Patches thoughtfully, poor Joe must have someone to depend on, and taken alone, he don't count more than a cipher. That's it, said Phil. With someone to feed him and think for him and take care of him and be responsible for him in some way or another, he'd make almost one. After all, Phil, said Patches with some bitter sarcasm, poor Yakpi Joe is not so much different from hundreds of men that I know. By their standards, he should be envied. Phil was amazed by his companion's words, for they seemed to hint at something of the man's past, and Patches, so far as his reticence upon any subject that approached his own history, was always as silent as Joe himself. What do you mean by that? Demanded Phil. What sort of men do you mean? I mean the sort that never do anything for their own free wills. The sort that have someone else to think for them and feed them and take care of them and take all the responsibilities for what they do or don't do. I mean those who are dependents, and thus who inspire to be dependent. I can't see that it makes any essential difference whether they have inherited wealth of what we call culture, or whether they're poverty-stricken semi-imbeciles like Joe. The principle's about the same. As they dismounted at the home corral gate, Phil looked at his companion curiously. You seem mighty interested in Joe, he said with a smile. I am, retorted Patches. He reminds me of someone I know, he finished with his old self-mocking smile. I've a fellow feeling for him, the same as you have for that wild horse, you know. I'd like to take him away from Nick and see if it'd be possible to make a real man of him, he mused more to himself than his companion. I don't believe I'd try any experiments along them kind, Patches, cautious Phil. You got to have something to build on when you start to make a man. The raw material's not in Joe, and besides, folks might not understand, he added significantly. Patches laughed bitterly. Well, I got my hands full right now anyway. End of part 1 of 2.